So thank you very much for inviting me. So it's a new experience for me.
For us as well.
Yeah. But yesterday when I said to my daughter, I go to a conference, she said, oh, the usual boring conference. No, no, there are robots. Oh, great, I want to come with you. So it's the first time that it happens. So yes, because my field of research is philosophy of language. So I hope to give my contribute by shedding light on some characteristic concerning human rationality that maybe can be useful also on the research on robotics. In order to do this, I'll try to, I will mainly refer to ancient Greek rhetorical and philosophical tradition. I will further explain why I think that it can be useful to go back to ancient Greek thought, which are the advantages of this approach. But the preliminary question is, can philosophy of language say something interesting for roboticists? Looking at the presentation of the workshop, I would answer, at least in principle, yes, it can. Since it seems that an important aspect to investigate is to understand how and within which limits we can transfer to robots some words usually refer to human beings as intelligence, decision, judgment, and so on. So this is a typical linguistic and philosophical question. Actually, so I try to answer a little bit to the question about the meaning of the word word. At least according to the so-called second Wittgenstein, so the philosopher Wittgenstein quotation, the meaning of a word is its use in the language. So that is, understanding the meaning of a word means understanding the way we actually use that word. Thus, in our specific case, in order to assess whether the word like intelligence or the expression making a decision are good descriptions for the activities of robots, we have to evaluate the way we use them when they are referred to human and to robots too. So I hope to give my contribute in this direction. Why, in order to investigate the characteristics of human intelligence, should it be useful to go back to ancient Greek thought and not to limit our research on the contemporary world? Which are, if there are, the advantages of this choice? A first reason why I consider the model of human rationality from ancient Greek an unsurpassed model is that we can find in that model the roots of a modern and contemporary notion of rationality, but devoid of many superstructures that maybe have contaminated a more transparent and authentic concept of rationality. Very roughly, I could say that Descartes is maybe the main guilty of this idea of rationality. This means two different but intertwined things. First, the adjective rational covered a much wider semantical spectrum than in modern languages. And the second, the dichotomy rational and irrational was not as clear as we usually think to be. A second reason is that the period between the 6th and the 4th century BC is a crucial period during which philosophers, but not only philosophers, started to reflect on the epistemological status of some practices like, for example, rhetoric, medicine, historiography. And this kind of investigation inevitably concerned also the nature of the cognitive operations realized by those who practice these activities. So the common feature of these practices is that they are all techni. It was quoted before, arts, craft, techniques, or maybe better, they aspire to be considered as techni. We will see soon what it does mean. Consequently, if we want to investigate the roots of human reasoning, it can be useful to understand the epistemological status of a techne and to shed light on the cognitive processes carried out by the technites, the technician, the craftsman. A last preliminary point: every philosophical theory is founded on an idea, a specific idea of a human being. It means that we construct our philosophical building around a model of human being. For example, the mainstream model, I can again roughly said the Cartesian model is that the human being is rational, he has to take decisions without the perturbation of the emotions, he has to reason in an algorithmical way, and so on. Depending on the model of a human being we take into account, the philosophical theory changes. I think that the same should happen with robotics. Also, a theory of robotics should have cleared the model of a human being to follow in order to build robots as much as possible able to emulate human beings. Again, choosing a good model of a human being to follow make the difference, I suppose. And I hope that the idea of a human being I will propose could be a good model to follow on for roboticists too. So let's start with this notion of techne. What is a techne? Why it's important to analyze the techne, to understand the very nature of human reasoning. The first aspect we have to consider is that all techne, like rhetoric, medicine, for example, have a common feature consisting on the intrinsic condition of uncertainty in which these disciplines find themselves operating. The essentially conjectural and therefore fallible nature of the knowledge of technitae depends on the circumstance. The fact is that they share, quotation, form of inference and reasoning common to probable practical deliberation. In rhetoric and medicine, just to consider these two examples, so the discovery of the means of persuasion or of healing depends partly on following science. The rhetorician and the physician sift experience, hierarchize effects and accident, read symptoms and signs, and distinguish among real and apparent causes. This condition, the fact of operating in condition of uncertainty, which is well represented by the activity of the technites, is actually the typical condition of experienced by any human being in his life. He lives in a complex world, that is, in a world where he always has to take decisions, choosing among several options, evaluating the alternatives, forecasting the possible consequences of his choices. Human being used to reason in condition of uncertainty, and that's why the functioning of a techne is a good case study to understand the way of human being reason. What's at stake in a techne, for example in rhetoric, as was showed by Emmanuelle Damblon in her works, is a specific form of rationality which is typical of human being. So it is necessary to concentrate now precisely on the notion of techne. It is Aristotle who provides us with guidelines. We can identify at least 5 fundamental traits of the Aristotelian notion of techne that will serve as a base for our reasoning. First of all, a techne, imagine for example rhetoric or medicine, is a form of knowledge intrinsically oriented toward doing, toward action, the healing or the persuasion. And it is based on a relatively stable corpus of rules which are not infallible, so that's really important, but which have an own form of reliability and therefore are susceptible to be taught. Due to these characteristics, a techne differs from the empiria, so the experience, which is not based on some stable rules, but it is just the capacity of the layman. But it's different also from the episteme, the science, which is the body of a stable knowledge, not aimed at to produce anything, but just for the theoretical knowledge, for example, the mathematical knowledge, the typical example provided by Aristotle. Second characteristic, the specific sphere of application of a techne is what Aristotle calls the for the most part, the osepitopoliou in Greek. This expression refers to a variegated and complex set of realities that are not necessary but are endowed with a specific, though variable, regularity and can therefore become the object of knowledge that is relatively stable and transmissible. The rhetorician, just to give an example, a very easy example, may try to persuade the jury that someone did not kill his own son, starting from the fact that usually, for the most part, fathers don't kill their own children. Of course, this reconstruction will be fallible exactly because it is true, but just for the most part, but not absolutely, thus allowing variation and exceptions. Third characteristic, the interwoven nature of theoretical knowledge and productive purpose that is typical of any techne forces the technites on the one hand to try to formulate a single general concept that includes similar cases, and on the other hand obliges him to never to lose sight of those individual cases to which ultimately his action is directed. He has to heal that patient, he has to persuade that auditorium. So the particular and the general does represent the two poles, which are both necessary and indispensable. But what is at stake here is not, as in the case of the modern notion of technique, only the question of the application of general knowledge to a particular, a specific case. The task of the technites goes beyond simply recognizing a particular case as being an occurrence of a certain general rule. It must also reconsider, even challenge, the very rule based on the specificity of the particular case. Indeed, according to the Aristotelian perspective, however important and necessary the general body of knowledge is in the domain of technique, ultimately it is the particular case that runs the show. What we might call a sort of strabismus of techne lies exactly in this need to look simultaneously at both the general rule and the particular application of the rule itself. A fourth characteristic, the ability to adapt to circumstances, or to use the Greek expression, to be able to grasp the kairos, the appropriate circumstance, is a skill essential to the rhetorician, the physician, and in general to all the technitai. The need to resort to the kairos is the direct consequence of the fact that the knowledge of the particular case, which is also essential for the technites, is not strictly part of the techne, in the sense that it is not manageable or forecastable a priori through theory. Being able to grasp the kairos requires a particular ability, partly innate and partly refined by practice and experience, that the Greeks called eustokia. It is the ability to hit the mark through practice. This ability is a conjectural form of knowledge, stochastic. We will come back to this point soon on this term in particular. The fifth feature of a techne, one of the peculiar characteristics of a form of knowledge that has to keep the particular and the universal together is its inherent fallibility, which, however, for the most part does not prevent a techne from being able to achieve its goals. This fallibility does not only depend on the errors or the cognitive and empirical limitation of the technites, but also, and I think that it is the most interesting aspect, on the very nature of the issues involved. What makes a techne reliable despite its fallibility is precisely its ability to adapt to its objects that do not lend themselves to a rigorous algorithmic treatment. So here we are at the core of the issue, analyzing the epistemological status of a techne, like rhetoric, like medicine, for example. means tackling the crucial question of following a rule. What does following a rule mean? In which way human beings used to follow a rule? And so I will try to shed a light on this aspect now. I suppose that it is a crucial issue for roboticists too, the way of following a rule. To better explain this point, I'm going to specify this notion of stochastic, this Greek verb, whose typical translation is, as I said before, to conjecture. So the importance of this notion depends on the fact that it refers to a way of knowledge, to a cognitive attitude that is not fully represented by the English translation to conjecture. To understand the relation between the notion of stochastic and the notion of techne, it's important to know that in the post-Aristotelian philosophical tradition, it was coined the expression techne stochastike, conjectural art is the typical translation, to identify some specific techne like rhetoric or medicine or the art of navigation and so on. But what is a techne stochastike? Why rhetoric and medicine are considered two techne stochasticae, and why this notion should be interesting for our purposes? To answer this question, it can be useful to analyze the term stochastic, so its etymology in particular. And it's possible to trace at least 5 different semantic nuances in this verb. The first of these is the less metaphorical one, which acts back to the etymology of the term. The verb stochastic is formed by the noun stokos. The stokos is the target, okay? So the original meaning of the verb is to aim at the target. This meaning is well represented by the act of the archer who take aim and point at the target. The second meaning, the one closest to the basic original one, is very frequently found in the Greek authors. It is to aim at doing something, which is a metaphorical semantic nuance, highlighting the activity of tending and intending to. So, once again, a good visual representation is that of the archer, particularly imagining the arrow that once it has fired, it goes toward the target. Just as this second semantic aspect is an extension of the original one, the same can be said of the third one, that is to say, the one that stresses above all the conative aspect. We are talking about those uses in which the typical translation of the verb stochastic is to attempt, to try. So stochastic means also to try, to attempt. The derivation from the other meanings is rather clear. Aiming at the target, like aiming at doing something, implies an attempt without any guarantee of success. Nevertheless, both in the first meaning of aiming at the target and the other ones of aiming at doing and trying to do, not wholly explicit is the epistemological meaning that characterizes the common translation of the verb stochastic as to conjecture, and accordingly of the adjective stochastikos as conjectural. Try to do something, aiming at doing something, implied in any case the need to make an hypothesis. In a sense, imagining and working out a pathway to follow in order to hit the target aimed, or to bring it to a conclusion that which one is trying to reach. In other words, one has precisely to conjecture. A reconstruction of this type also allows us to clarify a fifth aspect concerning the meaning of the verb stochastic, and that, in a sense, is negatively opposed to conjecturing. It is the idea of approximation. So stochastikos means approximative, which is intrinsically connected to conjectural activity, but which seems to underline a lack of method, a lack of stability. why did the Greeks coin this expression? So it's important to understand why a new concept starts to exist. What's specific in the techne stochastic eye that there is not already in the notion of techne? Actually, there is an accentuation. It is a way to emphasize some aspects that in some techne, like rhetoric and medicine again, emerge in an exemplary and significant way. Synthetically, we refer to a non-algorithmic cognitive activity which is not limited to performing pre-arranged procedures for reaching a goal, but which necessarily elaborates a hypothesis, conjectures, and devices in order to reach the target. So when we speak of a stochastic attitude, of a stochastic intelligence, we are referring to this type of knowledge and approach to objects that specify the techniques, but also, I can say, the human being in general. Anyone who wants to get a suitable knowledge of and taking decision about what can be otherwise in Aristotelian terms, has to know how to manage the possibility of the exceptions, the risk of an intervention from chance, and the possibility to apply to cure the rule he knows. In this way, it's clear that not only one type of rationality exists that is useful in cognitive processes, the algorithmic or mathematical ones, and consequently the classical opposition between rationalism and irrationalism becomes inadequate. Stochastic intelligence, far from being a sort of divination, is a form of rationality. So, techne stochastic and rhetoric in particular play a central role in understanding of human rationality. It is in the complex world characterized by regularity and variability at the same time that it does emerge the need for a mode of rationality that knows how to deal with the challenge of the unexpected, the unforeseen, the exception, without thereby becoming a form of irrationality. Moreover, the life of the human being predominantly deals with uncertainty, with a situation where knowledge of the rules alone does not guarantee the right decision making. But it doesn't happen because of cognitive limits of human being, but because of the very nature of the world in which we live, because of the physis tu pragmatos, as Aristotle said, the nature of the issue. I will just give an example of what I mean by referring to an old paradox the Greeks called the Sorites paradox. The word Sorites comes from the word soros, which means heap. The paradox says more or less this: if a heap is reduced by a single grain at a time, at what exact point does it cease to be considered a heap? We can easily say, if we see a huge mass of grains, that this is a heap, okay? When there is no grain or just one or two grains, it will be easy to say that there isn't a heap anymore, okay? However, we will not be able to indicate algorithmically the exact moment in which that heap will no longer be a heap. There will be a phase where some people will identify a heap, others will not. That is, there will be a phase in which we will be in doubt whether we should call a heap or not what we have in front of us. We cannot easily decide. This is just an example. Human being is constantly faced with situations like those of the heap, where he has to make decisions without, however, the nature of the issues allowing him to adopt a mathematical and algorithmic method. These are intrinsically complex issues because it is by definition impossible to trace rigorous and definitive limits. To use an Aristotelian metaphor, human being needs to use not a rigid rule, but a lesbian rule. That is the rule that, quotation, is not rigid but can be bent to the shape of the stone. So a flexible rule. A crucial aspect that cannot be hidden is that when faced with complexity, human being is constantly subject to the possibility of failure. making a decision in a complex world implies the need to choose among several options, several possibilities. This is the specificity of rhetorical rationality. But at the same time, it is precisely in the constant risk of failure that this man experiences his specificity, the extraordinary nature of his resources. To put it another way, managing the complexity means, first of all, being able to proceed by guesswork. And the rhetorical practice brings out in an exemplary manner this approach, this capacity to adapt the rules to the contingent situations, sometimes changing the same rules, sometimes elaborating new ones. It is within this framework, therefore, that, as Emmanuel Damblon writes, the rhetorical model, practical and humanistic at the same time, is the best context for representing a human reason. So the notion of techne stochastique, which I told till now, is interesting because the noun and the adjective of this expression evoke on the one hand the comforting safeness of rules, techne, so a corpus of rule. On the other hand, the disturbing uncertainty of fallible guessworking, stochastique. I will now introduce an Aristotelian notion that I believe can clarify these characteristics of the epistemological and anthropological model I'm trying to show today. And this is the notion of phronesis, whose typical translation is wisdom. Who owns phronesis, who has phronesis, the phronimos, the wise man, according to Aristotle, is the one who brings together the knowledge of the general and of particular, the one who can adapt the general rule to the particular cases. In other words, the one who can manage the complexity and the variability of the world and who knows how to make the right decision at the good time, at the kairos. Moreover, phronesis is practical, and practice concerns particular cases. In fact, as Aristotle says, using an example from medicine, quotation by Nicomachean Ethics, if a man knows that light meat is easily digested and therefore wholesome, but does not know what kinds of meat are light, he will not be so likely to restore you to health as a man who merely knows the chicken is wholesome. This passage is interesting for several reasons. First, the reference to the relationship between man and rule, facing with the complexity of the world. Second, the reference to the physician as an example of phronimos. The comparison between a physician and a rhetorician from the point of view of rationality is topical in Greek culture, and above all in Aristotle. The common trait is that the physician, like the rhetorician, in the attempt to diagnose and treat a disease, is faced with a complexity that overlooks him, with the unexpected that the rules cannot foresee. And this is the reason why the technites, the craftsman, goes beyond his own techne. This is why the rules of his techne are not sufficient. But this is also why the technites, and then the man in general, is constantly faced with the possibility of failure. But ultimately this is a human being. It is not pure irrationality, but is not even called infallible rationality. He has the constant possibility of managing complexity, but equally he has the constant risk of failure, exactly because of the complexity of the world. But the extraordinary nature of man is in this own condition, facing with the complexity of the world, is able to violate the rules, modify them, reinvent them, to show in them his humanity. To conclude, hoping that what I said may be useful, it seems to me that there is a sort of paradox. Robotics tries to build robots in the image and likeness of human beings, who, however, are fallible in the decision making. not because of cognitive limits, but because of the nature of the issues to decide on. And yet, people pretend robots to be infallible in making decisions. A few days ago in a newspaper there was a news about a driverless bus which had an accident with a truck just 2 hours after the inauguration. Apparently the bus did the correct movement, but it was not able to predict the unusual movement by the big truck driven by a man, which anyway would have been obvious to any human pilot. As the journalist noted, the fact has caused a stir because the driverless car is always presented as a car with an infallible technology. Instead, it's not. Driverless cars are supposed to circulate among human-driven cars, and therefore with behaviors predictable maybe only by a human. Robots too are meant to live in a complex world, and that's why it is to be hoped a robot phronimos, a wise robot, which is more clever than smart, and which can dare adapt its rules to the particular cases, depending on the particular situation, learning from the experience it does. A robot phronimos, this is perhaps the real challenge that awaits us. Thank you.
Thank you. Madame Emmanuelle Damblon.
Thank you, Salvo. Just a question about your comparison between rhetoric, medicine, and robotics as techni. I asked me if the question of responsibility in the 3 cases are comparable, because in rhetoric and in medicine, we are obliged to act. And so the risk is the risk. But we can refrain to act. But in robotics and in mechanics, maybe we are not obliged to act, and maybe we can decide not to build robots. So in this case, I think that the political and the ideological question is more important, maybe.
But I see that what people expect by the roboticians is to build robots able to act. So I want to say, when a robot has to act, is obliged to act, and it's not obvious, as you said before, but I suppose that at least at the level of what people expect to have is to have a robot that can do things, that can act in the world. And in the moment he has to act in the world, I think there is always the problem of responsibility, well, not by the robot, but the one who has programmed the robot. So well, I see that this is the great big ethical problem with robots. If they will become autonomous in a way, it becomes they are obliged to have a responsibility. So not them, but
Kind of responsibility.
well, yeah, no. This is another kind of responsibility, yes, but there is a sort of responsibility, I suppose. Yeah.
I have kind of a similar comment. I think I really enjoyed your talk. The problem that I always have is I start to discriminate in my brain the commentary we make that applies to the creator of the robot from how it applies to the robot, to the made artifact. And in this case, in fact, the question distinguishes those two clearly. And even when I think about things like conjecture and risk of failure, we have this funny problem. The rhetorician or the medical practitioner is a human being. They need to be cognizant of risk of failure, and they need to make conjecture and act. Got it. That makes perfect sense. But with the robot, our case is more complex, because in fact the idea of a robot being I'm going to use dangerous words here, but being cognizant of the risk of failure is nonsensical right now. Robots don't understand risk or failure, much less the risk of failure. They also don't understand conjecture. We can have explicit probabilistic reasoning in a robot, but it doesn't even understand metacognitively what conjecture is. So the irony here is that we design robots that act, yes, but the conjecture and the risk of failure is all on the head of the designers right now.
Yeah, yes, it's absolutely true. And what I want to say, but I see that exactly the comparison. We can do the comparison between rhetorician, physician, programmer, roboticist. It's okay. Maybe it works. It works better. But I want to say exactly this point that a robot cannot conjecture. A robot, but the robot too has to act in a moment. He doesn't know if it or he or she risks or not, but he has to act in any case. So I think that if you consider the problem from the point of view of the effects, it seems to be similar, the effect. But if you consider the problem from the point of view of the mind, of what is behind, is different.
Yeah, indeed your clarification of the etymology of stochastic is interesting, but our own use of it, at least my own use of it, is much narrower. I can give you the examples of many machines that act with an uncertain environment without any stochastic model and do it very efficiently. We do have robots that do just trial and error and perform the task. There are even simpler machines that I cannot call robots that do trial and error, writing pods to sort objects. And they are very efficient to deal with a specific kind of uncertainty and be able to perform a given task. I won't call it acting in a general sense. Now, a stochastic model is something else. A stochastic model is what we use in many planning algorithms in robotics and in other ways, where you do sampling. Even without doing explicit conjectures, you just sample into some search space. Your heap is enormous and you don't care. You sample and you have some criteria and you come up with some results. And this results is not foolproof correct. And you never claim that you have a machine that is infallible. This does not make sense. When you put any automation in a system, for example, in an airplane, you are not making this airplane foolproof and never crash. You are just trying to improve the rate of accident from the 80% errors, human errors, to something less, to some 10-8 or 10-9 rate of errors. So my last comment is you mentioned that philosophy, every philosophy has a model of human, and robotics should also start with a model of human in order to make their robots according to this model. But we are not making robots according to human. We are just making a machine to serve human. This is the entire purpose. At least in my view, the entire purpose is to make machine to serve human. Of course, we can try to study this or that aspect of human being with the help of this machine, but as a technologist, it's just to serve human, not to make it resemble to human. Although it may use some form of rational search with stochastic models.
Yeah. No, this is a misunderstanding that this. Yeah, no, but it's always a misunderstanding because we use human terms to define the robot's actions. Yeah. I say that it starts from this. So that's.
Okay, and you got it?
Yes, I think also that very interesting your presentation also. So congratulations. Sometimes we think that we are also researchers and scientists, but also we are engineers. So when thinking la machine, then that should work always. We are engineers, but sometimes we want to do different things. We want to create new robots, complex things, uncertain by definition. So we are looking in this uncertainty that you have been talking about. sometimes we are engineers. We have to solve one very particular problem, and we want to decrease drastically the uncertainty. The only way I agree is simplicity,